Welcome back, everybody. This is the Law and Crime Network, and welcome again to those of you listening on Sirius XM satellite radio. We're talking about the Shaun Harrison trial out of the Boston, Massachusetts area. This is the case of a school administrator who is facing charges for allegedly shooting a student right in the head. The student survived. One of the accusations underlying that charge is the accusation that this school administrator was dealing drugs even while he was going out in the community, saying he didn't like drugs, he didn't like gangs, and he didn't like guns. Well, the accusations underneath are that he was involved with all three, and we just saw a series of evidence photos flash on the screen from a Boston police officer who took many of those photos, saying, look, we recovered bullets, we recovered at least one weapon, we recovered marijuana from the defendant's office or apartment. So this seems to back up the story of the student who survived the gunshot, the student who said flat out, look, this administrator is no question the guy who shot me in the head. Ashley Willcott is a trial attorney, a juvenile court judge. She's been on the line with us helping break this down. We were saying right before the break that this is the sort of hard evidence that a lot of juries like. They get a story from a victim and they see the evidence along with it. So they just say, hey, look, the physical evidence matches the story. Thankfully, this victim survived. We're going to believe the state's case lock, stock, and barrel. That oftentimes is the way that this progresses, correct?
That's right. And, you know, this is a really sexy case in terms of the facts of this case, because everything you just said is true. Completely agree with you. I mean, it gives everything to the jury potentially on a silver platter to say there's hard evidence. Look at what this person did. And he clearly, I think, maybe living a double life, which criminals can do.
Well, that certainly is the accusation. The evidence thus far has been panning out to indicate that's what's going on. Court has ended for the day in this case, so we're going to dip back into some of our archives here, our previous clips of the testimony. One of the witnesses was Lillian O'Flaherty. She is a 10th grade school teacher in that school. Here's some of her testimony from earlier in this case. She had an eyewitness account of some of what is alleged to have been going on here. Testimony there from a teacher who was one of the first ones into a bathroom where the victim in this case, Luis Rodriguez, was fighting with another student. And she testified critically there that Shaun Harrison, the administrator who is the defendant in this case, really didn't do much to try to break up that fight. Is it possible that the defendant himself wanted harm to come to that student and he was just letting the fight go along? Is that possible? That seems to be the link that prosecutors are trying to make. We'll be back with more analysis of the case of the alleged school administrator who was living a double life as a drug dealer when we come back here on Law and Crime. Back to the Law and Crime Network, and welcome again, especially to those of you listening on Sirius XM satellite radio. We're going to take a bit of a break from covering the trial. We're covering out of Boston, Massachusetts, so take a look at some of the top crime headlines that are making news on lawandcrime.com.
Today's top crime stories trending on lawandcrime.com and across the country. A pair of accused killers remain at large after a control panel malfunctioned and unlocked a pod of cell doors at the Orangeburg-Calhoun Regional Detention Center. A group of prisoners were able to overpower a guard in the control room and open a door to the rest of the facility. Once outside, the convicts were able to scale a fence using sheets to get over the razor wire. Authorities are now searching for the escaped prisoners, including 2 men accused of murder. In June of 2017, the same detention center had a prisoner escape due to the malfunctioning locking mechanism. A Florida man suspected of a homicide died after an hours-long standoff with police in Panama City, Florida. 49-year-old Kevin Holroyd was under investigation in connection with the death of 30-year-old Clinton Street, and police were watching his apartment. A neighbor reported smelling gas fumes, and when officers approached the home to investigate, Holroyd fired at them from a second-story window. SWAT teams were called in, and when they breached the apartment, they discovered it was doused in gasoline and Holroyd was dead. He was found wearing body armor, had several high-powered rifles, and hundreds of rounds of ammunition. It's still unclear how Holroyd died. A judge in New York ruled in favor of the parents who sought to have their 30-year-old son kicked out of their home. The parents, Christina and Mark Rotundo of Camillus, New York, served their son Michael 5 notices of eviction before they sought an injectment proceeding in court. Michael, who represented himself in the hearing, asked the court to dismiss the request, claiming he was never previously expected to contribute to the maintenance or finances of the household in the 8 years he lived with his parents. The judge disagreed and ordered him out. Michael plans on appealing the ruling. Those were today's top crime stories. I'm Anthony Velez for Law and Crime.
And welcome back, everybody. We're going to continue our review of the Shaun Harrison case out of Boston, Massachusetts, the case of a school administrator and preacher who was anti-guns, anti-gangs, anti-violence, and anti-drugs. That was his life on the surface. Prosecutors, however, have alleged he was living a double life where he was involved in pretty much all of the above. He's on trial for allegedly shooting a student of his in the head. That student miraculously survived that attack. Was on the witness stand earlier in this case, pointed at the defendant and said, absolutely, that is the guy who shot me. Cross-examination, though, focused on whether or not the student had the facts straight, questioned the student as to why he didn't point the finger at this particular school administrator earlier on. One of the witnesses who also testified in this case is Jose Nova. He is a former student at the school. He also confirmed this marijuana use was actually going on. Let's listen to his testimony. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network. Welcome again to those of you listening to us on Sirius XM satellite radio. We're going to talk today about the Tex McIver sentencing, which happened this afternoon a few hours ago. Tex McIver is the Atlanta area attorney who was convicted ultimately of felony murder related to the death of his wife, Diane McIver. She was a successful CEO. He was an attorney at a very big law firm. They both made a lot of money, but prosecutors said that his income was dropping and that ultimately Tex McIver shot his wife to get control over her finances, including some property, a ranch that they own. Ashley Willcott is a trial attorney and a juvenile court judge. She's here with us for some analysis of the Tex McIver case. Ashley, this was one of these cases that we watch very closely, and a lot of people coast to coast watch very closely, not only because you have a couple of high-profile people, a victim and a defendant, but also because the facts were pretty clear-cut. This was an issue of law that we had to try to sort out. We know Tex McIver had the gun. He admitted it. He admitted it went off in his hand. He was a bit confused, at least under his version of things, as to exactly how the trigger went off. He said he was sort of dozing off in the back of the vehicle. A lot of things to unravel in that, but ultimately the facts were pretty clear cut. It wasn't so much a whodunit, just as to what to call this legally. Is it murder? Is it negligence, just putting someone in an unreasonable risk of harm? Was it recklessness? Exactly what was this? And I think that's what made the case so interesting.
I agree with you, Aaron, and you said something earlier that I still stand by and agree with you on as well, which is these are complex legal matters, right? Mm-hmm. What type of charges when you know he shot his wife, but you have all those other surrounding issues, and then to expect a jury to understand those charges right off the bat and say, okay, we know all the different ones and what they mean, and this is the one it is really a difficult task, because even legal scholars are struggling with what do these different charges mean in this particular case.
Exactly. So we were sitting here trying to figure this all out, and people on the jury were given a pretty high hurdle here. They didn't have to do what they're doing in the Shaun Harrison case that we're also covering, where they're basically just trying to say, okay, does the physical evidence match up with what the multiple witnesses are saying, and therefore we agree that he is the one who actually committed this act. This was a jury that had they did have to settle some facts, okay? But ultimately, they really had to determine what law should stick to those facts. And that's a much harder job for members of a jury to do.
Right. Absolutely. It is. And it's something that, again, the judge's role is really to guide them through the procedures in court, to make sure everything's followed correctly, and to tell them this is the law and now you have to apply those facts to the law. But it's so much easier said than done, again, for lawyers, much less ones who aren't lawyers and have heard all this evidence and have to make a decision.
And look, I mean, I'm not here to apologize for Tex McIver, and I think that some of the things the guy did were just highly bizarre. I'm not sure that I agreed with his version of the story, but look, the burden is on the state here, and the state was trying to characterize this as this big, huge financial motive for intentional murder that they basically tried to insinuate was premeditated in a way. bringing up emails about a disagreement over a will that had occurred years and years before the gun even went off. I think that was a bit of a stretch. That's just me. And apparently the jury agreed, because the jury didn't convict on that top charge. They convicted on this sort of convoluted felony murder attached to an underlying aggravated assault, ultimately finding that the defendant wanted to injure his wife, not to kill her, and that she accidentally died from the injuries, even though that's not what he intended, which doesn't seem to match up with the state's theory of the case in my mind, but ultimately that's where the jury went. We're going to listen to some of the victim impact statements in the sentencing hearing today. One of them from Danny Jo Carter, that critical witness who we heard from so often here in our review of the Tex McIver case when it was going on. She was a critical witness. She was the one who was in the car. She was driving the car when that gunshot went off. She gave a victim impact statement about the loss of her dear friend, Diane McIver. That statement in the sentencing hearing just a few moments ago earlier today. An emotional victim impact statement from Danny Jo Carter. She was driving the car when Tex McIver in the back seat was holding a gun. He somehow pulled the trigger. Wasn't intentional, wasn't an accident, wasn't because he was just waking up after nodding off in the evening after having a large meal. The jurors found that Tex McIver intentionally pulled the trigger because he wanted to injure his wife, not necessarily kill her, and that she ultimately died from the injuries she suffered. We are back on the line, however, with Ashley Willcott. She's a trial attorney and a juvenile court judge. Ashley, when you're sitting on the bench and you're listening to statements such as this one from someone who has something to tell the court, who is either victimized or whose friend lost his or her life. I know you don't really handle homicides yourself, but you sit on the bench, and oftentimes we sit here and wonder, do the words that are uttered in these sentencing hearings really matter, or does the judge have a lockstep decision in accordance with sentencing guidelines that a judge has to make? Do these hearings actually make a difference in the actual sentence?
I believe they do, and they do for me. So you're right. They're the federal guidelines that you have to follow, that I have to follow. But keep in mind that, especially in this trial, Tex McIver's team, defense attorneys, they have not presented any information about who this woman is. You don't hear anything from all of his interviews or comments or statements after she was killed to learn who this woman is. And so the victim impact statement really is a chance to paint a picture of, who is this person? Was she thought of well in the community? Was she someone that people liked? Was she genuinely a good person? And what that does is really produces some sympathy and understanding, and reminds you this is not just someone that was killed. It puts an identity with the face. It gives you an idea of who the person is that was killed, and that helps the judge make an informed decision within the court's discretion and within the sentencing guidelines of, this is what an appropriate sentence is in this particular case. So I do believe that it makes a difference. It should make a difference.
Well, I might take you to task on that, Ashley, because, look, the Supreme Court's been back and forth over American jurisprudence on whether or not the victim's standing in the community should influence a sentence. Are we saying in American jurisprudence that if the victim was someone either rich or powerful or popular, that the killing of that such person is somehow worth a bigger punishment than perhaps a transient who happens to meet an unfortunate end? Or should the punishment be the same for everyone?
Absolutely. The punishment, that should not make a difference, whether they're rich, whether they're poor, whether they're homeless, whether they have a mansion. None of that should matter. The punishment should be the same. But what does matter is, what kind of person are they? So is it someone, whether a homeless woman or someone of no wealth versus this particular wife who did have wealth? Was it a good person, standing in community in terms of reputation? Was she someone that would physically assault people? Was she someone that would yell and scream at people? Is she someone that incited her husband to, on numerous occasions because of her behaviors? That's what I mean by standing in the community.
I see. I understand. Well, we're going to listen to some of the words of the defendant himself in this case, Tex McIver, speaking in court, and he was chided by many people, including the judge, for really not apologizing for the death of his wife. But this is some of what he had to say. Words from the defendant himself, Tex McIver, after a murder conviction. That was pretty much the entirety of his statement to the judge just before sentencing. Ashley Willcott, trial attorney, juvenile court judge. The defendant basically saying a lot, but a lot of people criticizing him for not even bringing up his wife until about 6 minutes into the speech. Does that count against him?
Well, I think certainly it's something a judge is going to take note of, because not only did he wait that long to mention his wife, he never said anything about the fact, I shot her, any remorse, any, I can't believe this, I'm sorry. And it was a little bit of a cold, this is the relationship we have. She's on the other side and we're all good.
Yeah, a lot of people are, not necessarily very happy about the way that he did that, but he did read from notes. He did have everything prepared, presumably with his attorney's blessing as to the way he was going to put things. Ultimately, a sentence of life with a chance at parole, but my understanding is he won't get that chance until 30 years from now. He'd be 100 years old before he had a chance at parole. Will he live that long? That's always the question that we have. We're going to wrap up for the day very, very shortly here. Ashley Willcott, trial attorney, juvenile court judge, thanks a lot for joining us again here on the Law&Crime Network.
Thank you, Aaron. I appreciate it.
Okay, we're going to wrap up the broadcast today with a reminder that we're live from at least 9 a.m. until at least 5 p.m. with coverage of trials and hearings like the one we just watched from coast to coast. For now, this is Aaron Keller, and for everybody here at Law&Crime, have a good evening. We'll see you tomorrow.